from my side to this book launch, a book that is entitled Theorizing World Orders, Cognitive Evolution and Beyond. And another book that will feature quite a bit today is Emanuel Adler's World Ordering, A Social Theory of Cognitive Evolution. So think about these two books. We'll talk a little bit about that. But for the most part, actually, we'll talk about trying to go beyond them. So we want to exercise a little bit of critical reasoning here as well, and thinking about how to move on. Please join me in welcoming the panelists for today. I'm going to start with those who you see on the screen there. And Manolo, hello from Vienna. That is, so welcome Emanuel Adler. He is Professor Emeritus, Andrea and Charles Bronfman Chair in Israeli Studies from the University of Toronto. And feel free to give him a cordial welcome. Then next to him is Piki Ish-Shalom. He is the Ephraim and Shirley Diamond Family Chair in International Relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Welcome, Piki. And to my right here is Vincent Pouliot. He's the James McGill Professor in the Department of Political Science at McGill University. And Vincent, welcome to you too, a very cordial one. And he also started teaching a course for us today, so even a double welcome to you. Yes. No, you're perfectly right. As a way of introducing this perhaps a little lightly, yeah? Theorizing world order. Some of you may be afraid of the theorizing bit. Yeah? One way of thinking about this is think about a legally binding instrument. Think about, I don't know, the UN Charter. Think about the declaration, perhaps, Human Rights Declaration, Universal Human Rights Declaration. Think about something like the World Summit some time ago, free trade agreements. So there are all kinds of ordering instruments that are fairly easy for us to detect. We just have to look at them on a piece of paper, basically. And for the time being, let's refer to that as the foreground of world order. And many debates that we have about world order are actually about this foreground. And the debate about, say, the decline of the liberal world order, for the most part, is actually debate about the things that are in the foreground. But there's also, and that's a concept that I borrow now from Emanuel Adler, and who borrowed it to a considerable extent from John Searle. There's also a background. Otherwise, I wouldn't have to tell you something about the foreground, right? And the background for Searle is when we engage in communication, then there are certain things that are quite obvious. We speak about them, we make them explicit. But there are other things that are not necessarily spoken, they're not necessarily referenced explicitly, but without them, the communication wouldn't work. And when you look at Emanuel's World Ordering book, then he conceptualizes that as background knowledge and practices. And background knowledge, he says there's something about epistemic and something about normative background knowledge. And then practice that and enact that background knowledge. Giving you an example from one of my pieces of research on global health. Yeah? In global health, you have lots of different actors, and two of them are probably most prominent. There are the medical experts on the one hand, and there are the diplomats on the other. And the medical experts, they're used to their controlled experiments, very scientific and everything. They look at data very carefully. And diplomats, they probably have a little bit of a different background knowledge. And one thing that's very important for them is to make their own nation shine. very simply speaking. If you look then at the institutional foreground in global health, then you stumble over the international health regulations. And with the international health regulations, there is basically a division of labor between these medical experts and the diplomats. And the diplomats states they have to report promptly if something happens, if an unexpected outbreak of a disease happens. And then it is up to medical experts to make decisions, for instance, to declare a medical emergency, public health emergency of international concern. And now on paper that's quite clear, but this is not how these public health emergencies usually play out. They play out quite differently. With Corona, for instance, they played out very differently. So states usually wanting to make their own nation shine don't necessarily report promptly and comprehensively. Medical experts, they on paper are supposed to make the decisions, but there's all kinds of diplomatic maneuvering that can happen, and that way, say the bar set for determining a public health emergency of international concern actually ends up being much, much higher than is foreseen in the international health regulations. You may say now, still gray theory, but there are all kinds of debates, if I stick with my example now with global health, about how to strengthen global health and how to strengthen especially pandemic preparedness. And if you look at that now from the foreground, then you want to have amendments probably to the international health regulations. Perhaps you also want to have a new treaty, a pandemic treaty, for instance. But if you look at backgrounds, then there's probably a revisiting of the background knowledge necessary as well. And that probably is even more important. So for instance, states usually have a clear-cut hierarchy of issues that they take care of. Security tends to be on top, and health somewhere near the bottom. And if that background knowledge persists this way, then we're probably going to continue to have all kinds of problems with global health. Yeah? So just as a way of briefly introducing the matter, and one could probably now go on and on with all kinds of other issue areas. Nuclear non-proliferation would be something that would come to my mind, I think to Emanuel probably too. He's also worked on this in the past. And we could think of lots of other examples there, and we'll obviously talk about quite a few of these examples, and also feel free to ask us then questions about the Ukraine if you want to. The book itself that we are launching today, there are really fantastic contributors in it, so if you're interested in it, some are very, very well known in the discipline, Stefano Guzzini, Peter Haas, Beverly Crawford, Christian Roy-Smith, Emanuel Adler himself. There are also quite a few rising stars, or actually stars that I would say have risen already in the discipline, Alina Drieskova, Simon Pratt, Maika Sonderji. And we prepared it in workshops in Toronto and here in Vienna, so to some extent we've come full circle now in terms of the book project. And I should also mention that the three of us, so the three editors, Piki, Vincent, and myself, were lucky enough to be students of Emanuel, doctoral students, about 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, a long, long time. And he's taught us a lot, perhaps most importantly, to question even his own thoughts. And in that spirit, we're also going to conduct this event today. And probably Piki, Vincent, and me, we all developed our own mantras. So mine probably would be something about communication, Piki probably about critical theory, Vincent probably something about hierarchies and practices. So you'll see how some of these things are going to play out today. We'll try to do things as interactively as possible. So Emanuel, I'm going to ask a few questions to the panelists, and then we're going to enter into a debate amongst the three of us, and please feel free to join us in this debate as well.
Okay, I didn't hear that, but I think we have we have talked before about what we were going to say. First of all, I want to start saying that I'm so sorry that I'm over here and not over there. I so much wanted to be over there, but sometimes wishes do not come true. So I'm very sorry about that. I want to thank you. May I call you Markus? I mean, are we in, is this informal enough so I can say Markus?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, good. So Markus, I'm very, very grateful for putting this workshop together, and for Vincent and Piki, who are your co-producer from the beginning of Theorizing World Orders and participating here on this workshop. By the way, have you told that if they buy the two books, they get a discount? I didn't get that. I'm not sure, but okay. But I'm grateful to the three of you, but especially Markus, that and the academy, you know, that they did the you know, you took the effort, and I'm so sorry that I'm over here and always online with these problems of you know, of Zoom, but we'll survive. What I'm going to do is I would like to do something very hard, which is in 5-6 minutes or so describe the theory of cognitive evolution, and it's so complex that actually it's very difficult, and that's as I hope we will talk about. That's one of the problems, that it's too complex, too many parts, and this is why people get asking. So this is good, this is, but how do I apply it? Okay. So I'm going to describe. I'm going then to say in a minute what the subjects I touch in my conclusion, and then say in half a minute what I'm working right now, which will go beyond what I have been doing right now. Now, as everybody in the audience can see, there is a crab in the background. So I'm not going to say any more. If you're wondering why do I have a crab in the background, feel free to ask in the Q&A. Okay. So cognitive evolution theory explains why certain configurations of practices and knowledge organize and govern social orders epistemically and normatively, and how these configurations then evolve from one social order to another. So as you can see, cognitive evolution theory is very unconventional. It draws attention to what I call IR's software, namely the epistemic and practical backgrounds of world politics, rather than the hardware, the states, other conventional actors, and exclusively material power, which is what most of my colleagues do. And that's part of the problem, explaining to others that, no, this is not up here, this is the software. It's not the parts that move. Now, specifically, drawing on evolutionary epistemology, which assumes a general model of evolutionary change, and process ontology, which, according to which processes of becoming are the reality that underlie entities, cognitive evolution is a social theory of collective learning and the simultaneous evolution of and stability of multiple and overlapping international social orders. I will return to this in a minute. Now, why cognitive evolution? Because cognition is social and learning takes place in communities. More precisely, social orders originate and derive from, continuously consist of practices, the background knowledge that I heard you talking about, Markus, that is bound with the practices and the communities of practice, which serves as the vehicles. The existence and relevance of any social order, therefore, depends on the ability of a given community of practice to continuously reproduce its constitutive practices as opposed to others, thereby ascribing certain meanings to material and social reality, at which time its practitioners' expectations and dispositions preferentially survive in their minds. Now, why now cognitive evolution? Avoiding analogies to natural science evolution and its mechanism, the theory argues that the process of creative variation explain how and why fluctuations or evolutionary variants of order occurs. Selective retention, on the other hand, governs how social practices are selectively reproduced and institutionalized. The master mechanism of cognitive evolution theory, I call epistemic practical authority, or the capacity for practical meaning fixation. Epistemic practical authority is not merely agential, but also structural. Namely, it is a field of social and material forces. It reorganizes social life, making certain practices and knowledge stick or spread across communities, as well as new generations of practitioners. But how does reorganization of social life occur? At times, fluctuations acquire a critical mass, they tip, they cross an intersubjective threshold, and become collectively recognized within and across communities of practice. Alternatively, because of resilience, they don't. Change is dialectical and governed by uncertainty, thus very hard to predict. Resilience, such as everything else in social life, is a potential, thus it depends on cognitive evolution. Now, and this is related to the title and the subject of the book and IR, rather than concentrating on one historical or the contemporary world order, cognitive evolution theory suggests multiple and overlapping international social orders. But cutting across them, there is a contestation of communities of practice about systems of rule between interconnectedness and disassociation, internationalization and extreme nationalism. If you read the papers these days, I think you will know what I'm talking about. Primarily based on common humanity practices and values, and what I call epistemological security, the theory also suggests a normative theory of better practices and reversible contingent limited progress. The theory argues not that the bounded progress has taken place or that will take place, but about what progress would look like if it ever would take place. That has been the source of many misunderstandings. It also argues that practices of truth validation socially construct collective trust. It cautions, therefore, that practices of truth subversion and alternative facts threaten any order, but particularly the liberal international order. Especially when dark times for world ordering loom large, as I think they do now, it is imperative to believe in our common humanity. In the concluding chapter of Theorizing World Orders, I continue to theorize about evolved dispositions and expectations distributed across global, international, regional, national, and local communities of practice, namely no more levels of analysis. A concept of embedded globalism that anchors global practices in redefined national interests, for example, about climate change and AI, a preliminary theory or theoretical understanding of politics in cognitive evolutionary process, a redefined concept of power as a field of social and material forces, practical democracy that gives equal weight to expertise elites and publics, how to mitigate artificial intelligence dangers for humanity with cognitive evolution theory, and a concept regarding how the flow of knowledge in and across communities of practice regulates and normalizes war politics modi operandi. Currently, I work on cognitive evolution theory and one communication of practices across the communities of practice, within and across, as it were, the nerves of government, as Karl Deutsch used to refer to the, elements that is beyond the muscles, or the software, technology, particularly AI, and the cognitive evolution of democracy. Now, this is enough for the next 150 years, because I'm already in an age that probably I will not live unless AI achieves a miracle very, very soon. Then this will be, I will try to achieve just a little bit of that agenda. But to end, if you ask me whether cognitive evolution can explain the war in Ukraine, I will be happy to answer that question. Thank you very much for your attention.
Vincent, we talked about the Theorizing World Orders book quite a bit, right? And there are all kinds of contributions. There are some critical remarks as well. There's some challenges that authors point out. Which ones would you say are the most important of those challenges?
Great. Thanks, Markus, and delighted to be here, and thanks, of course, for inviting in and organizing. Just to take up the torch, this is obviously a book that tries to look critically at Emanuel's book and past work. And so the different contributors mount a variety of challenges. I've decided to focus on two, at least, just to launch the conversation. If we want to talk about others, I'm more than happy. Both of these challenges sort of straddle the social normative theories that are a great strength of Emanuel's book, but I'll try to make them speak as well about to the problem of the current world order crisis, which I think is what's on pretty much everybody's minds these days. The first challenge that I wanted to mention has to do with the material foundations of the existing world order. Let's call it the liberal order, for lack of a better term, because I think both books actually complicate a little bit that story, but just for the sake of simplicity. So you spoke about the foreground, the background. I guess what I'm referring to right now is the infrastructure, right? So what are the foundations upon which cognitive evolution can thrive across history and across places? And this refers to one particular chapter, especially in the book. So I'm trying to convince you guys to perhaps take a look and read it carefully. A chapter by Elena Dreyashova. I will confess, I think it's my favorite chapter in the book, where Elena actually criticizes cognitive evolution theory for what she thinks is insufficient attention to the material foundations of cognitive evolution. And on that topic, I very much hope that someone will ask Emanuel the question about the crab, because that's the sort of the example he uses to address the question. So hopefully we'll get to the crab at some point. But essentially what Elena is saying is something very simple that I think everybody will sort of recognize. She essentially argues that our practices, so the ways in which we behave, so in world politics, it's diplomacy, it's treaty making, it's war, it's all the kinds of patterned ways of behaving, right, that have evolved historically. That's what Emanuel writes about, and what we write about as well. So the ways in which these practices, common patterns of action, the ways in which they evolve is highly connected to technological and material changes in societies, right? An example that Elena uses, which I think is brilliant because it's so simple and it touched me because I remember, is how our practices of writing, the ways in which we write, changed when technology switched to from the typewriter to the computer. And I'm actually old enough to remember typing on a machine before the screen. And just think about copy and paste, right? Which is essential to writing today. I wouldn't be able to write if I didn't have the function of copy and paste, so I can move around paragraphs and sentences from page 1 to page 30 very easily, the snap of a finger, and which was obviously not available or afforded by the typewriting technology, right? Good luck. If you wanted to do that, you had to start it all over again. And essentially what Elena is saying is, well, when we invent new technologies, new artifacts like this, obviously our practices, the ways in which we do things, writing, for instance, also evolve, right? Basic point, but if you think about it, I think the implications are tremendous, right? Especially in terms of thinking about how the world order is actually evolving. And one example that I think connects pretty well with Emanuel's book and his chapter in our book, his conclusion, is a sort of the rise of social media, which is, a fundamental technological revolution, certainly probably as important as printing, right, several hundred years ago, in terms of how it transforms politics and society, right? And I guess the question I wanted to raise for you guys to think about and perhaps have a discussion later on in the Q&A is, how exactly is this affecting fundamental practices of the current order, such as democracy, for instance, right? We've all already seen how social media afford new kinds of subversive or so-called post-truth practices, and Donald Trump is obviously one example, but I think we can actually look much beyond that and think about how there are new ways of performing politics that are available through social media that weren't just 20, 30 years ago, and the implications for politics, including global politics, not just domestic politics, are tremendous. I think even deeper, we can ask ourselves whether global governance and minimally democratic forms of global governance can be afforded through the kind of political economy in which we live, right? With very strong, dominant, I guess some people would say neoliberal forms of capitalism, the kinds of socioeconomic inequalities that it has engendered and continues to engender, and how this kind of material infrastructure clashes with some of our aspirations and practices, sometimes domestically in terms of social justice or social democracy. And so essentially the first challenge I wanted to talk about is this connection between material, technological changes, and then the ways in which we practice politics from the local to the global level. The second challenge that I wanted to discuss briefly is something that's very dear, I know, because I've known Emanuel for a long time, dear to Emanuel's heart, is the possibility of progress, right? So Emanuel is far from naive, and he mentioned how he's aware, and he's absolutely right about that, I think, of how fragile any form of human progress is and has been historically, right? History is full of back and forth between all kinds of orders, social orders, some much more progressive than others. There I think, again, to encourage you to take a look at the book, the conclusion of the book is probably the latest Adler material that's available for those who are wondering, where Emanuel really works hard to sort of suggest how, and he alluded to it in his comments as well, how exactly would it be possible if there were to be progress? How would it work? What it would look like, right? And that's a complicated question because obviously, at least from a practice perspective, there's not an imminent view, right, that everybody would agree this is progress and we all have to strive for it, right? Progress is itself a political issue that different communities fight over, and that's probably all for the better, right? That's what democracy is. There's a clash of values and perspectives. There's political debate. We want that, right? But then even so, what kind of minimal notion of progress could there be for the world to improve, right? And what Emanuel defends is, again, I think is a relatively simple idea, is what he calls common humanity practices. What does that mean? It means all these ways of doing politics and behaving in society where the bottom line is a mutual or equal recognition of each other's the value of human lives. Right? Kind of simple to a point that I guess a skeptic would say, well, if it's that simple, why haven't we seen it more in human history, right? If all we need is a better recognition through our behaviors of the equal values of human lives all across the world, then, sounds like a recipe that should, a cake that should cook easily. And so I guess one could say, okay, why don't we see it? And then, what I wanted to do is perhaps try to dig or scratch this a little bit deeper and ask a couple of questions that Emanuel perhaps can take up and you guys can weigh in as well. One is, even if we all agree that we can imagine limited contingent progress based on common humanity practices, is there really a way in which everyone can recognize the value of human lives in the same ways? And this is not just a rhetorical question, actually. We all, it's easy if you think in ideological or political theory terms to think that, for instance, some people think that we actually acknowledge the value of human life and human dignity by maximizing human potential, right? A kind of a meritocratic system, right? Where we're going to help, people to really reach their top capacities, right? That's what I guess the university system in a way represents. But that's actually a very different way of understanding the worth of human lives, in a way at least, not irreconcilable, but different from saying that we should care for the weak, right? The kind of a social justice understanding of what a human life worth is, right? And so both of these systems of values, I think, equally recognize the worth of human lives. If you extrapolate that to the world order, we move from development aid, global redistribution of resources, from the north to the south, for instance, that would be the more social justice stake, to something closer to what the OECD or the World Bank are promoting, which is, well, we're going to help states that have good governance, not too much corruption. We're going to lift them up, right? A tide lifts all boats is sort of the mantra from that perspective. So just so you guys see that these two perspectives end up advocating very different forms of global governance, right? That they're not, at least in my view, and I'm sure Emanuel perhaps, I'm not sure, but perhaps Emanuel would disagree, it's not clear to me how exactly we reconcile that. And if you look at the history of global governance, and you compare what the UNDP, United Nations Development Program, does and what the World Bank does, we already see that these two templates, these two understandings of human dignity sometimes have a difficulty connecting with one another, right? And the last example I wanted to give, and then I'll turn over to you, Marcus, is something that Emanuel defends. And again, take a look at his conclusion, I think, for more details. He calls it embedded globalism. So for him, this notion of progress and common humanity practices would lead us to a different kind of global governance than the one we currently have. He calls it embedded globalism. And then he talks about how certain practices that we already see on the rise, you guys have probably heard of so-called multi-stakeholderism, right? Like Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. So it's kind of new practices of governing globally whereby states, companies, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, corporations, pharmaceuticals all come together around the table and then they try to resolve problems, right? So those are sort of the emerging kinds of new practices in global governance that we see these days for the past 10, 20 years. And Emanuel, I think, advocates for these kinds of transformations. I just wanted to perhaps play the devil's advocate a little bit here and remind ourselves of some of the difficulties that we already see with practices like these, right? The privatization, for instance, of social welfare that we see in countries like Haiti, for instance, right, where the education and the health system have been pretty much privatized through multiple interventions and decades of intervention. So there are real issues behind these more inclusive practices that on the face of it, I think look good. They're more efficient in a way. They're more democratic because they're more inclusive. They're able to mobilize resources from the private world that states on their own are not able to mobilize. So there are all kinds of nice things attached to these new forms of global governance, but also clear trade-offs, right? And I think we're just starting to see some of these emerging. And so again, I just wanted to throw this example out as a kind of, again, to just ride the tide of Emanuel, this limited form of progress. Perhaps I'm a bit more pessimistic. I've always been a bit more pessimistic than Emanuel, but I think that these kinds of progress actually bring with them new hosts of problems, right? And I guess I wanted to raise that for the sake of discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, Vince, thanks a lot. So the question that I wanted to ask you, so from a critical theory point of view, I don't know, could there be something like a critical theory of cognitive evolution, and how would it look like?
Yeah, I'll start with apology, move to some thank you, and then go all the way to critical theory. I apologize because I find it hard to feel you and hear you, so I'm a bit disconnected, and it's hard to tailor even my comments to the event. And I also hate to speak in Zoom. Okay, so I'll try to be as brief as I can. But I need, before I'll get to critical theory, I need to say some words of thank you. And first, you know, all of us, right? All the three of us owe Emanuel so very much, right? In the way he shaped me, right? And in the ways he enabled me to shape myself. If I'll use his theory as a metaphor, all right? So for the cognitive evolution, which was my own intellectual development and the context of my intellectual development, for who and what I am, right? Except Manolo, I won't credit you for my bird watching. That I will leave to myself, right? So editing this book, or co-editing, and that's also an important thing, was a way of giving back, and it was a pleasure giving back all the gratitude, all the depth I owe Emanuel, and it was also a pleasure because of the in the editing. I went back into the emails just before the evening or during the evening, and it all started sometime around 2016, right? You remember it was like a conference in Toronto, and then a conference in Vienna, and then the book, and that's like 6 years. That's a lot of time, and in those 6 years, you know, the three of us, we were known as the junta or the troika, right? In our, you know, in our better practices, we were known as the troika. When we were more dictatorship, we were known as the junta. But the three of us had the ball together, and in those 6 years, and I speak to myself, but probably it also for the three of us, in 6 years, there's so much difficulties, hardship, crisis in the professional front, in the personal front, right? And the three of us, what I lacked very much is the way we could back each other, right? And took over one the other, and handed the ball between ourselves as personal crisis came and left, and that was also a pleasure. So I thank Emanuel for who I am, and Markus and Vincent for the book, and here's the book, and I'm quite proud of it, and I hope all of you in the audience will find some interest in it, and I think I like it very much as a standalone piece, the edited volume, but also as something that accompany Emanuel's own work and his last book also, right? So we accompany Emanuel's book, we accompany Emanuel's book, and we try at least to open some, as we called it, new vistas in and with Emanuel's theory. Okay, so and now I get to the critical theory, because one of the things in Emanuel, when he enabled each one of us, again using his metaphor, let's call us Emanuel's mutants, right? Each of us to develop in his own direction, and I went to critical theory. I don't know why, but I'm in the camp of critical theory. And when I read Emanuel's book, and when I try to put my insights into the introduction of the book and through the editing of the book, I read it through the lenses of critical theory. And I thought of, trying to distinct critical theory from what can be called mainstream constructivism. And it's not a dichotomy, right? It's a spectrum. You have constructivism, you have critical theory, you have post-structuralism. Each one of us will portray the differences a bit differently, the boundaries between those camps. Some of us will put them together, some of us will divide them into three distinct camps. I think about it as a spectrum, and what distinct critical theory, what characterizes critical theory are 4 points which might be called sensitivities, four sensitivities that characterize critical theory and carve it outside of the mainstream constructivism. The first, and that's obvious, is the constitutive and reciprocal relations between knowledge, and it can be also ideas, norms, right? But knowledge and power and politics, right? So critical theory is very sensitive to those reciprocal and constitutive relations. Secondly, critical theory is very sensitive to the historicity of structures or orders, right? It could be social orders, it can be world orders. Those orders came during history, came about during history, and as they came about, they can also go away, right? If we go back to the relations between power and knowledge, you can untangle these relations and tie them together, tie those relations differently in a way that will help to constitute a new world order or a new structure, right? Usually critical theorists like to speak about structures, and post-structuralists like to speak about what happens after the structures, right? So that's the second point, and that's very, very important. The third, and I go back to the first point, there's reciprocal relations between power and knowledge. The third point will emphasize and will be sensitive to the observation. I don't want to speak in terms of facts, right? But at least the observations, the insights, that those relations work also regarding academic knowledge. Academic knowledge is not autonomous in this regard. It's also constitute politics and power. And that's, we have Robert Koch's seminal sentence that theory is always for someone and for some purpose. And that's almost, the Bible of critical theorists, the different critical theorists. And from that comes the fourth point, which means, which emphasize that we, as scholars, some of us will call ourselves social scientists, I prefer scholars, we are also, we bear social responsibility. We are actors and agents in this world order. And we have social responsibility, or we have responsibility to try and bring progress into it. And here I relate, to Vincent's point, what is progress? I won't get into that here, right? But there is a notion that we have social responsibility as scholars, not just as humans, right? It's not that we have 2 hats or 3 hats. No, as scholars, we have this social responsibility to act in this world and try to bring progress into it, improve it, right? So those are the 4 sensitivities that for me characterize critical theory, and those are my guidelines as a scholar when I theorize and write and teach and whatever. When I look at Emanuel's work, and especially this last book, right, World Ordering, through those 4 points, I get like mixed results. Right? For example, about the relations between power and knowledge, Emanuel is very sensitive, very keen about the relations between knowledge and power. Right? Go to his first book, The Power of Ideology. It's about that, right? And it's also in this book, right? Ideas, knowledge, shape, to some extent, reality and politics. I think he glosses over a bit the obverse directions of relations, right? The influence that power and politics have over knowledge over ideas, background knowledge, all those kinds of things. That's missing a bit in his theory. The second point about the coming and going of social orders, that's the heart, one of the many hearts of Emanuel's writing, and especially in this book, right? And the notion of becoming, right? That's part of cognitive evolution. Things are not just being, they're becoming. And if they're becoming, they also can go away. So that's very much in it. And also, you know, the possibility of progress, or at least bounded progress. And here, the 10th chapter in your book, Emanuel, is the culmination of the book in that sense, right? That where you speak about bounded progress, better practices, human realism, the possibility, right, to have a change in the world orders, right? And the possibility of progress, yeah. And this is why you have now, you're almost begging us to ask you about, ask you to explain what's going on in Ukraine, right? You somehow need to give explanations of where progress has went, right? And so that's very much, as a critical theorist, I feel very comfortable with the 10th chapter. And I feel comfortable about that also because of the third point, right? It is obvious to you, Emanuel, obvious that our theories are informed by the world outside, and that our theories and knowledge have some influence on the world. And that's, you know, one of the importance of the 10th chapter, right? How to bring about the change, and that the change is possible, and that and that's very important, that our moral commitments inform our theories, right? This is why you speak about human realism, better practices, right? You want to bring about embedded cosmopolitanism, right? All those better world, right? The theory is informed by your moral commitments, and that's excellent. I'm all for that. And that's also, by the way, I think once you're informed by pragmatism, it's also part of the deal there. The fourth point is where you fail or refuses to cross the Rubicon, right? Because the outcome of the third point, or all the first 3 points, is that you as the writer of this book, is also an agent in this world. And you have responsibility to this world, right? And as a scholar, we need to be an active participants in this world. This is the Rubicon that, again, you fail or refuses. And by the way, I never gave you, this evening I didn't give you any good reasons to be critical theorist. I just announced myself being a critical theorist. So you may have very good answers why not being critical theorists, why not cross the Rubicon, right? Sadly, we don't have time to get into that here. But this is the point where the Rubicon is still waiting for you, but I'm not afraid, or I have no worries, because you still have a couple of books to write, and one of them will take you across the Rubicon. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
Piki, thank you. And although it's tempting now to hand over to Emanuel straight away, I think I'm going to ask, look at the audience, and please feel free to ask questions, really whatever comes to your mind. Yeah, a lady, just hold on a second, and we're gonna have a microphone, because in that way, then they're gonna hear it as well. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. I have a question to you. As I better said, I have something to say to what you said. As far as I understood, you said that we are facing a change of global governance, more in the direction that more players come into the field, not only the governments, but also private sectors. What I think, doesn't that also mean that we have less democracy, although you said we have more democracy? Less democracy, I mean, because all these private players, nobody voted. So they just emerged, And I'm sure within their organizations, they do not have democratic structures. They are not voted by anybody. So don't you think this is more, this is rather less democracy than more?
Thank you. There was a question directed to Vincent, and I'll always do 3 at a time, maybe. Yeah, then just 1, 2.
Thank you. My name is Carla, and I would like to know, what do you think about the Great Resignation and people quitting their jobs? Is it an outcry for a totally different organization of work, environment, and labor as such? And what is your take on this? How do you think this will play out in the future, and what are the main drivers behind this? Thank you.
Is that also for Vincent? Yeah. And maybe we're gonna in a sec, yeah.
Hello, I'm Alexandra. I have a general question for whoever wants to take it. I think we can all agree that the liberal order is undergoing somewhat of a crisis. Do you think that given the current situation where several European and EU countries are embarking on more of a nationalist path, that is possible that we are going to be approaching a social order, or a point where the current European social order could be tipped over? Thank you.
I was asked about the current situation in Europe and whether we are approaching a threshold. And as I insinuate in my very short talk about cognitive evolution, I do much more in detail in the book, the intersubjective thresholds where we, in this case Europe, realizes that we have crossed a threshold and we are in a new, in this case, regional order, cannot be known beforehand. The same way we couldn't know about half an hour before Berliners starting to go to the wall, and that 24 hours later, the whole thing will start, in a sense, like Humpty Dumpty crumble down. Europe in the last 10 years was very close to the threshold. Europe had the Brexit crisis and the Grexit crisis, and there were other so-so crises, and now there is this crisis. But as I said very, very succinctly in this talk, there is also resilience, and we cannot know. Resilience is it's a possibility, it's a potential in the in the philosophical sense. We have potentials for resilience, Europe, but sometimes, according to complexity theory, a very tiny, not as big as Putin invading Ukraine happens, or together with some event like we are experiencing now, that brings the whole thing beyond the threshold. But look what happened in Ukraine. The pundits immediately said, well, I'm thinking about Mersheimer, of course, whose theory is, does Windows. Immediately, oh, okay, the order is gone and we have a new order. We are back to the old business, etc., etc. But 5 days later, the pushback began. This didn't resolve European problems, but it managed to partly unite Europe against Putin and to do things that were inconceivable 2 days before Putin decided, surprisingly, even for many of the Russian leaders, to invade Ukraine. So from a from a cognitive evolution perspective, we are dealing here with not only one order, but with several orders, one which is liberal and trying to defend liberal practices, starting with democracy, including those who are eating away from European democracy, like in Hungary, Orbán, for example. And on the other hand, we have practices, and we have a community of practices where we could not predict that something like the invasion of Ukraine would happen, but we could predict that given these practices, which includes practices of totalitarianism and those who were so greatly described by Hannah Arendt, that could happen from Putin, and they did. Evolutionary theory cannot predict things, can look at the giraffe and say, okay, why does the giraffe has a long neck? And then explain why it has a long neck and not a short neck, okay? This is part of the software of any evolutionary understanding or epistemology, okay? So if we look in terms of, and I'm going to talk about, to address Piki, I'm going to talk about Foucault. You know, if we look at the epistemes that are at play here, you know, the kind of thing that happened coming from Russia, it's not entirely surprising. It was unexpected, but we could not expect this to happen. Let's say coming from Austria or coming from today's Germany, right? Or from any other democratic country in the West, who together are now trying to defend democracy, not just the institutions, not just NATO. You know, it's the software, it's democracy, it's the values, it's the identity, which got together and pushed back against. I remember Kerry saying after Crimea and saying, "Oh my God, this guy is doing something that is bringing us back to Bismarck." You know, what does this bringing back means? That he and many others, and there are others, unfortunately, in the world, including inside democracies, including the so-called biggest democracy in the world, that would like to practice what Putin is practicing. Okay, so in that sense, my theory can explain retrospectively why this happened. It could not predict, because it doesn't have. This is about the knowledge and the practices behind power politics, but at the same time, practices of diplomacy, of democratic alignment, about politics that is about association, horizontal association as opposed to domination. Now, this is not unrecognized. This is not recognizing these other things. But when we think in terms of communities of practices of knowledge, these things can be explained at that level, at the level of knowledge, but it cannot predict whether this is going to be what changes, that brings Europe over the threshold. In fact, if we look at what happened yesterday in France, we could say, well, we were closer to this happening, really close, and it didn't happen. And I'm not looking into French politics and blah, blah, blah. You know, it didn't happen. Now, that doesn't mean that, okay, democracy in the West is safe and hooray, okay, you know, let's celebrate the liberal international order. Absolutely not. This is a contestation. It's going on between interconnectedness and extreme nationalism and populism. And it goes on, and unfortunately, it's going on in Europe. But being the pessimist I am, I always, you know, surprised by sometimes things, you know, as people say that PIP happens, you know, sometimes some good things happen and we don't expect them to happen. But this is my view about uncertainty. That's another paper. Now, I can see Robert Cox's break. It is not only is free from power. We tend to, I lost that. Wait, there is so much here. Hold a second. I want to, liberalism in Europe, there will be 3 questions. Concerning academics and politics, isn't the primary function in agenda furthering of academic discourse, and isn't the double role agenda following breaking with the primary function? Piki, the ball is yours. Yeah.
Yeah. And also the next question. Well, it might have been if we accept, you know, a division between politics, power, and knowledge. If there is no not distinction, but if there's strong relations between the two fields, let's call them field in the Bordesian that Vincent and Emanuel will feel comfortable. If the two fields are intimately connected and reciprocally and constitutively shape each other, there is no, you cannot separate broadening academic discourse or academic knowledge and broadening human knowledge, right? When there's a threat on democracy and freedom of speech outside of academia, it doesn't stop there. It will enter into academia. And when you broadening academic knowledge, right, and academic discourse, it is your responsibility to bring it also outside and to broaden also. So there's no betrayal. I mean, the betrayal will be to remain in the ivory tower of academia, which are not ivory towers. And it's not just about morality. If you fail to do that, the backlash will come from outside into academia, right? I live in Israel, I operate in Israel. I experience how a narrowing freedom of speech outside threatened to narrow also academic freedom of speech. And so it's like shoulder to shoulder. The two agendas are twin in that sense. So no, it's not abandoning your academic responsibility. It's shouldering your responsibilities, and there are many of them together. And about censorship, and I think that's related. And here is, I'll use again the metaphors of Emanuel. Critical theory might be the software of, it's not the hardware, right? You can be a critical theory that criticizes in a Marxist perspective, right? You can be critical theory that criticizes from a feminist perspective, the power relations within society. You can come in from everywhere. And censorship in that sense, I mean, yeah, there's state censorship, of course, but there's also the neoliberal censorship, which is not enforced by law, but by the logic of economy, right? And that works also in social media or in the social networks, right? And that's a threat. Now, I read now that Musk wants to buy Twitter, what his intentions are, what he will do with that, I don't know, right? Yeah, but yeah, censorship is a threat, of course, but censorship is not just by the state and with law, right? It comes from many directions, and each of the critical theorists will be sensitive to other kinds of censorship. and will try to struggle, he or she will try to struggle against those censorships in order to broaden the academic discourse, but also democratic discourse. And you cannot have academia without democracy. Okay.
May I add something about this?
Yeah, welcome to critical theory, Emanuel.
Well, I am. First of all, in the last thing I wrote in general about constructivism, I said that the middle ground has moved much closer to critical theory. And I agree with your description of my work that it's there, but it's not totally there. I can say more words about each of the four points that you raised. But I want to address this because I want to bring an anecdote. Because if it's right that I helped shape you academically, I'll tell you what helped shape academically myself, where I started, which was my dissertation before I wrote The Power of Ideology. I was sitting in a coffee shop in Lima, Peru, with a technocrat who works on science and technology. The book was about science and technology. And he said, and that was the beginning of epistemic communities, at least for me, he said, you know, we work like guerrilla. We work like subversive elites. And subversive in a Foucaultian perspective means to do certain things without other people noticing that you are subversive, especially at the level of software, at the level of knowledge. And he said, you know, we attack, we retreat, and this is how we sell our ideas about, in that case, was about technological independence of Latin America, dependency. Well, this guy's name is Francisco Paco Sagasti, and until a month ago, he was the president of Peru. I mean, he did all the way from academia, being subversive. He didn't have to say, well, I'm doing this for gender, or I'm doing this for the issue of racism. He was subversive. He was attacking and retreating, to the point that his views spread around Latin America for a while. They were quite powerful, and he kept trying to affect politics until he became, he switched spaces and went to become president of Peru. And I'm saying this because that was the first, the first line that led to epistemic communities, which was affecting normatively, not only causally, what is good and what is not good, in a very Platonic sense. Do I have to tell you this thing, Phaedrus? And whether it's the environment or arms control to prevent a nuclear war, or now climate change, etc. But epistemic communities don't have to raise a flag. And we discussed this, Piki, many times, even when you were working on your PhD and your books, because this is the tension between also the academia that says certain things with the isms and practicing, affecting the world. I think that dealing with, and one of the things I did just a few months ago, it was published 3 days ago in I.O., which is a paper on John Ruggie and the beginning of constructivism and his work, because he ended up being quite disingenuous about what was going on, the ability to influence the world in the right direction from academia. So he went to the UN, and he had quite a lot of impact, especially on corporate human rights, when he was in the UN. And it was all there in his dissertation in 1975. It was all there. But he worked for that for 30 years with this theory, that theory. IO didn't want it. He tried again until he said, okay, you know what? I'm closing shop. I'm going to the UN. And he ended up applying epistemic communities in the UN. So it's much more fluid than constructivism or modernist constructivism and Foucault over there. I'm a Foucaultian in many ways, you know, but I'm not in other ways. And as I said in our book, in our joint books, what I do is I get lots of ideas of great people, men and women, and then I don't follow gurus. I just try to, you know, do my own thing with them. So am I you know, in this sense, I'm performing something like something that is more radical than constructivism? I don't know. But I know one scholar that did that much before I did, and he's considered the father of realism, and that's E.H. Carr. But people don't read E.H. Carr right, and especially a book he wrote in 1941 about morality and the future of Europe. He foresaw the European Union. Who would have said that? So, and he was pushing for that in a quite critical theory kind of way. You wanted to say something about Robert Cox, probably.
No, just Robert Cox is great. I agree about the primary and secondary levels of education. I'll be very brief. And there's the crowd. I agree. They're very important, but at least, and here I'll restrict myself to Israel, where I know more. There are more tools of the state. There are more, you know, the state has more leverage over teachers in primary and secondary schools, and they're tools of the state. All right, I see my kids when they come back from school. All right, that's the internalization of state ideology. I, as tertiary teacher, right? I have the luxury of academic freedom. I'm being paid to think and teach about ideas. So yeah, they can do a much better job than me in the most critical phases of education. But sadly, it's harder for them, and I have the privilege of doing so. So this is why, so this is why I think the ball comes back to us, at least in Israel again.
No, thanks. Emanuel, I just have, because I have to hand over the word to Vincent quickly, because about half an hour ago you got a question.
What was it?
and we never responded. Yeah.
On your question, I think what's the point I was trying to convey is in a way dual. So on the one hand, I think that the way in which these new practices are talked about, narrated, legitimated right now in global governance, in global policy making, right, is to suggest that these kinds of new multi-stakeholders partnership, or call it the way you want, hybrid models of global governance, public-private, are more democratic in the sense that they're more inclusive, right? So that categories of actors that had never made it to the global stage, NGOs, civil society, private corporations to a certain extent, now can access it, right? So that's sort of and that's what in the class that I'm teaching, that's what we're talking about in global policy making. There's really this movement, this wind that suggests that this is progress. The point I wanted to make actually goes in I think, the same direction as you. Is it? Right? And what I wanted to emphasize here is that, it's not necessarily to criticize specific initiatives, even though I myself as a citizen am critical of these things, but rather to think, can we really imagine a global democracy that includes or that rests on forms of policy making where logics of, for instance, profit making are that prevalent? There is, for me, at the very least, perhaps not a contradiction, I don't know if I want to go that far, but certainly a friction. And I think COVID gave us the perfect example, right? We, because actually it's humanity, decided that vaccine patents were private. That's very odd if you think about it. We could easily live in a different world where we would realize that humanity's sake is at stake and that patents for vaccines have to be publicly owned, publicly distributed, publicly, it's not that far-fetched or weirdo, I think, to imagine a world where it wouldn't be possessed by shareholders and then distributed. And the way that COVAX has works, for instance, I can speak for my country, Canada, which is bragging about, we distribute vaccines to the poor countries. Well, we distribute the vaccines that are close to the expiration date that we're not able to inoculate to our population, right? And, so the question here is, there are contending and clashing logics, even from a political economy perspective, behind these practices, I think. And I think it's important for us to, be lucid about these things, right? It's, behind the veil of more inclusiveness are certain political, economic, material logics. They're not more democratic whatsoever, quite the contrary. On your question, which I think is really important, on new practices in the labor milieu, for instance, I think you're really going to the core of what practice theory is. Practice theory is a kind of a bottom-up understanding of social order, right? So the way the world works, call it social order, completely depends on our everyday practices. When these things change, for instance, in labor, right, new forms of resignation or conditions or wage structures, then the social order evolves. And again, to go back to COVID, because I think, it's an easy example these days, because, that's what we've been going through for 2 years, at least in North America, and I was having that discussion with Markus actually earlier this afternoon, we have huge labor shortages, structural, lasting labor shortages. Just to give you an easy image, like McDonald's closing the shop for lack of staff, right? Like literally, the shop is closed, no staff, right? And this has to do, I think, with your question of how exactly people now, after COVID and the essential workers and the kind of new practices that have evolved out of the emergency situation, and a lot of people just saying, well, you know what, I'm not going to do these kinds of jobs for that kind of wage under these kinds of conditions anymore. And the entire political order, in my view at least, and again, at least looking at North America, is changing. It's probably going to be slow, but it is changing, right? I don't think we're going to live in the similar political economic structure again. So in a way, your question, I think, was interesting because it reversed a little bit the point that I tried to make, how practices depend on material structures. In a sense, what you raise as a problem is, okay, but then when we change our practices, how is this going to transform social structures, such as, for instance, labor structures and the sort of the labor to capital relationship? And so I think this is how we need to think about global governance. It's not something super far from us, distant, abstract, that we can't make sense, can't touch. No, global governance is all the everyday things that even us as citizens do, of course, the elites and the big guys and decision makers as well, but it starts with us, right? And the ways in which we every day practice things, and that includes certainly the labor conditions.
Yeah. Vincent, thanks a lot. Piki, Emanuel, thanks a lot. I really apologize for the problems of a technical nature. It's an hour and a half later, and I think you are a little bit on the tired side. Thanks to the Austrian Research Association, there's going to be a reception next door. And then feel free to continue the conversation with Vincent or with myself. And yeah, so please a big round of applause to the panelists.